The air grows colder with each step downward. Stone walls press closer as the spiral staircase descends into the belly of Corvin Castle, where torch flames dance shadows across medieval granite. The light barely penetrates here, in these dungeons carved from living rock in the Carpathian heartland of Transylvania. Each footfall echoes, bouncing off walls that have absorbed centuries of suffering. And somewhere in this darkness, beneath layers of history and horror, lies the answer to a question that has haunted humanity for over 500 years. What kind of darkness could transform a prince into a monster? This is not legend. This is not the fiction of Bram Stoker's imagination. In 1456, a man was dragged through these very passages and thrown into a cell that would become his tomb for 7 years. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia, and when he emerged from this stone womb, he would become the most feared man in Eastern Europe. They would call him Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. They would call him the Impaler, for reasons too terrible to forget. But in these dungeons, something happened. Something that went beyond mere imprisonment. The man who entered was not the man who left. And the castle remembers everything. In the year 1440, as Europe trembled beneath the shadow of Ottoman expansion, a Hungarian military commander named John Hunyadi stood upon a limestone ridge in the heart of Transylvania and made a decision that would echo through centuries. He would build not merely a fortress, but a monument to power itself. This would be Corvin Castle, and from its very first stone, it was designed to break the human spirit. The site Hunyadi chose was no accident. Perched above the town of Hunyadiara, the rocky outcrop had served defensive purposes since the 13th century. When the Knights Hospitaller first recognized the strategic perfection of this terrain, beneath the older fortification, passages carved by ancient hands wound through the mountain's heart. These medieval crusader knights had understood something fundamental about this place. The land itself was a weapon. Sheer cliffs dropped away into shadow on 3 sides. The Zati River curved below like a natural moat, its waters cutting through rock over millennia, creating an abyss that seemed to descend into the earth's very core. But Hunyadi envisioned something far more ambitious than his predecessors. He would create a castle that didn't simply defend against enemies. It would terrorize them. Every architectural choice in Corvin Castle served this dual purpose: military function and psychological warfare. The Gothic style he embraced was no mere aesthetic preference. It was theater, designed to inspire dread. Construction began with the foundations, but not the kind built upon open ground. Hunyadi's architects worked with the mountain itself, carving chambers directly from the living limestone. These weren't storage rooms or wine cellars. These were dungeons, excavated deep beneath what would become the castle proper. Workers descended into the rock with hammers and chisels, creating cells where no sunlight would ever penetrate. The stone was wet with mineral seeps, cold even in summer, and the air tasted of earth and darkness. Some of these chambers existed long before Hunyadi arrived, remnants of the Hospitaller occupation, but he expanded them significantly. The older dungeons became merely the beginning of a subterranean labyrinth designed to house those who displeased the ruling power. Above ground, the castle rose with deliberate menace. The Knight's Hall Tower climbed first, its height carefully calculated to dominate the skyline from every approach. Master masons imported from Italy and Hungary brought Gothic innovations that made the structure seem to defy gravity. Pointed arches distributed weight in ways that allowed walls to climb ever higher. Flying buttresses became skeletal fingers clutching at the towers, functional yet monstrous in appearance. Each tower was crowned with steep roofs and spires that pierced the sky, like weapons aimed at heaven itself. The main entrance posed a particular architectural challenge and opportunity. Between the castle and the ridge behind it lay a gorge, a natural cleft in the mountain that dropped 60 feet to jagged rocks and rushing water below. Rather than fill this gap or build around it, Hunyadi's architects chose to emphasize it. They constructed a bridge, but not a simple span. The Gothic bridge that connected the castle to the mainland stretched across that abyss on a single soaring arch, narrow enough that approaching forces would have to compress into a vulnerable column. Standing on that bridge, visitors would have no choice but to look down into the void beneath their feet, to feel the wind rising from that darkness, to understand precisely how far they could fall. The main gate waited at the bridge's far end, a massive Gothic portal with an iron portcullis that could drop in seconds, sealing the entrance with steel teeth. Above this gate, murder holes allowed defenders to rain destruction upon anyone caught between the portcullis and the outer door. The entrance passage itself was designed as a kill zone, with multiple gates and guard chambers where invaders could be trapped and systematically destroyed. Once past the outer defenses, the interior courtyard revealed the castle's true scale. Surrounded by walls that climbed 5 stories in places, the courtyard functioned as both administrative center and demonstration of power. Here, justice was dispensed with theatrical brutality. A stone platform at the courtyard's center served as the site of public punishments. Medieval Transylvania operated under a legal code that viewed public suffering as both deterrent and entertainment. Criminals were flogged, branded, and mutilated where the entire garrison could witness. More serious offenders faced execution by methods that varied based on their crimes: beheading for nobility who fell from favor, hanging for common thieves, and for traitors, or those accused of sorcery, burning. The castle's role as both fortress and prison became central to its identity. While the upper floors housed Hunyadi's family and military commanders in chambers decorated with carved stone and imported tapestries, the lower levels served darker purposes. The dungeons weren't merely holding cells. They were instruments of psychological destruction, carefully designed to extract confessions and break resistance without necessarily leaving marks that might offend medieval sensibilities about torture. One chamber, known later as the torture room, featured stone walls permanently stained dark from centuries of use. The room's acoustics were particular. Screams echoed upward through ventilation shafts, carrying to the courtyard and inhabited chambers above. This wasn't accidental. The castle's designers understood that the sounds of suffering served as a warning to everyone within earshot. Guards would lead prisoners past this chamber on their way to cells, ensuring they heard what awaited if they proved uncooperative. Another dungeon, carved deeper into the limestone, was circular with a domed ceiling. At its center, a hole descended another 20 feet into bedrock, too deep to escape, too narrow to lie down in comfortably. Prisoners lowered into this pit would stand in water that seeped from the rock, their voices echoing back from stones that absorbed their words and returned only distorted sounds. Some prisoners spent weeks in such conditions before interrogation even began. The isolation, darkness, and cold accomplished what physical torture might have taken longer to achieve. They made captives eager to confess anything, agree to anything, simply to be removed from that suffocating stone embrace. The strategic importance of Corvin Castle extended far beyond its immediate vicinity. In 1440, Transylvania existed as a contested borderland caught between Christian Hungary and the expanding Ottoman Empire. Hunyadi himself was a warrior of legendary status, having won significant victories against Turkish forces that threatened to sweep through the Balkans into the heart of Europe. The castle served as both his family seat and a military headquarters from which he coordinated defensive campaigns across the region. Its position allowed control of key trade routes through the Carpathian Mountains. Merchants traveling between Wallachia and Hungary had to pass within sight of those towers. The castle's garrison could deploy rapidly to intercept Ottoman raiding parties, or conversely, to extract tolls and taxes from anyone who wished to use the roads Hunyadi controlled. This economic leverage funded further military campaigns and expanded the castle's already formidable defenses. Throughout the 1440s and 1450s, additional towers rose from the rock. The Capistrano Tower, the Buzdugan Tower, the White Tower. Each addition made the complex more impregnable and more psychologically overwhelming. Visitors approaching from the town below would see these towers multiply against the sky, each one adding to the impression of limitless power and resources. The legend of the castle's name adds another layer to its dark mystique. According to the mythology that Hunyadi's family cultivated, their coat of arms featured a raven, and this symbol carried deep significance. The tale claimed that when John Hunyadi was still an infant, a raven stole a ring from his mother. She feared the worst, but the bird returned, dropping the ring back into the cradle. From this omen, the family adopted the raven as their symbol, a creature associated with battlefields, death, and prophecy. The Latin word for raven is corvus, from which the castle took its name. Corvin, Ravens themselves gathered around the castle in significant numbers, drawn by the refuse of a large garrison and the remains of executions. They perched on the Gothic spires and called to each other across the towers at dawn and dusk, their harsh cries echoing off stone walls. Medieval prisoners, lying in darkness below, would hear those calls filtering down through ventilation shafts and imagine the birds as harbingers of their fate, waiting to feast on their remains. The castle developed a reputation that extended throughout Transylvania and beyond. Stories circulated about prisoners who entered its gates and were never seen again. Some of these stories were undoubtedly true. Medieval justice moved swiftly and with little concern for what later ages would call due process. A lord with suspicions about a vassal's loyalty might imprison the man while his lands were confiscated, then quietly execute him once the property transfer was complete. The dungeons held not just criminals but political inconveniences, economic rivals, and anyone who posed a threat to the ruling powers. By the time Vlad Dracula would arrive here decades later as a prisoner himself, Corvin Castle had already been breaking spirits for a generation. The systems of incarceration, interrogation, and intimidation were well established and refined through years of practice. The castle had become a machine designed to extract submission, powered by architecture that transformed stone andug into psychological weapons. The Gothic elements weren't decorative. They were functional expressions of power. Those towers reaching toward the sky declared that the castle's masters could build higher than nature itself. The bridges, spanning impossible voids, demonstrated engineering prowess that bordered on sorcery in an age when most structures were simple wood and earthwork fortification. The dungeons carved from living rock showed mastery over the earth itself, the ability to shape even mountains to human will. This was the legacy Hunyadi created, a fortress that defended not just through walls and weapons, but through the terror it inspired in all who saw it or endured imprisonment within its depth. Long before Vlad Dracula spent his years in these shadows, Corvin Castle stood as proof that humans could create hells on earth, places where hope died more certainly than bodies, where stone and darkness became tools as effective as any blade or flame. The boy was 11 years old when they took him. Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, learned the first great lesson of his life in the golden halls of Adrianople, far from the cold stone walls of his Transylvanian home. He learned that trust was a weapon wielded by those with power, and that safety was an illusion purchased with the blood of one's children. The year was 1443, and the Ottoman Sultan Murad II required insurance against his father's loyalty. Young Vlad and his brother Radu became that insurance, hostages in velvet chains, prisoners in a gilded cage where the screams from the palace dungeons could be heard echoing through marble corridors at night. The Ottoman court was a place of exquisite cruelty disguised as civilization. Here, the boy witnessed executions carried out with theatrical precision. He watched men flayed alive for crimes against the Sultan. He observed the methodical application of torture as both punishment and spectacle. But most importantly, he learned that fear was a currency more valuable than gold, and that reputation could be wielded like a sword to cut down enemies before battle was even joined. The Ottomans taught him Turkish, Arabic, and the art of warfare. They taught him logic, philosophy, and military strategy. But the lessons that truly shaped him were written in blood on stone floors and whispered in the screams of those who displeased the Sultan. His father was Vlad II, also called Vlad Dracula, the Dragon. The elder Vlad had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon in 1431, a prestigious chivalric order founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman advance. The order's symbol was a dragon, coiled and threatening, its tail wrapped around its neck, hanging from a cross. When Vlad's father joined this elite brotherhood, he earned the surname Dracul, meaning dragon. But in the Romanian tongue, Dracul carried another meaning, a darker interpretation. It also meant devil. When young Vlad eventually returned to Wallachia, he carried his father's legacy in his name, Dracula, the diminutive form, son of Dracul, son of the dragon, son of the devil. Both translations would prove prophetic. The question that would haunt historians for centuries was this: which meaning did the people of Wallachia whisper when they spoke his name? Did they see him as the dragon's heir, protector of Christendom, or as the devil's spawn, a demon clothed in human flesh. The boy's captivity lasted 6 years. 6 years of watching his brother Radu slowly transform, embracing Ottoman culture, becoming a favorite of the Sultan's son, Mehmed. 6 years of seething rage while his father navigated the treacherous politics of Eastern Europe, playing Ottomans against Hungarians, Christians against Muslims, survival against honor. And then came the ultimate betrayal, the wound that would fester in Vlad's soul until it poisoned everything he touched. In 1447, when Vlad was just 16 years old, his father and older brother Mircea were betrayed by the Wallachian nobility, those boyars who had grown fat on privilege and power. Vlad Dracula was assassinated, murdered by men he had called allies. But young Mircea's death was worse, much worse. The boyars buried him alive, driving the stake through the earth above his grave while he still breathed. Some accounts say they blinded him first with red-hot irons. Others claim they buried him facing downward, so that he would dig himself deeper into hell with every desperate attempt to escape. The method varied depending on who told the tale, but the message was always the same. The dragon's line had been extinguished by those who should have served it. Except it hadn't. Vlad remained, and the Ottomans, those same captors who had imprisoned him, now became his unlikely sponsors. Sultan Murad saw an opportunity, a chance to place a ruler on the Wallachian throne who understood Ottoman power intimately. In 1448, backed by an Ottoman army and burning with a rage that had been forged in 6 years of captivity and one moment of ultimate betrayal, Vlad took the throne of Wallachia for the first time. This first reign was brief, lasting only 2 months before he was deposed by a Hungarian-backed pretender. But it was long enough for the boyars to understand that something had changed. The boy who had left as a hostage had returned as something else entirely, something that smiled with dead eyes and spoke of justice in tones that promised agony. For the next 8 years, Vlad waited. He learned patience in exile, living in Moldavia and Transylvania, watching and planning. He studied his enemies, learning their weaknesses, cataloging their betrayals. And in 1456, he returned to claim what he considered his by right of blood and suffering. This time, his reign would last 6 years. 6 years that would transform him into a legend. 6 years that would make his name synonymous with horror for the next 5 centuries. He began with the boyars. On Easter Sunday in 1459, Vlad invited the noble families of Targovite to a feast. The oldest and most prestigious families came dressed in their finest clothes, suspecting nothing. They had eaten and drunk their fill when Vlad's guards sealed the doors. The older boyars, those who had directly participated in his father's murder, were impaled on stakes in the palace courtyard. Their deaths took hours, sometimes days. The younger ones, those who had merely benefited from the crime without committing it, were forced to march 50 miles to the ruins of Corvin Castle, where they would rebuild the fortress stone by stone. They worked without rest, without mercy, until their fine clothes rotted off their bodies and fell away in tatters. Most died from exhaustion. Those who survived became the foundation of a new nobility, one that understood that privilege came with a price written in pain. But it was the impalement that made him legendary. The wooden stake, sharpened but not too sharp, oiled but not lubricated enough to ease passage. The method was precise, designed to avoid vital organs, to maximize survival time, and therefore suffering time. The stake entered through the rectum or vagina and was slowly forced upward through the body, sometimes emerging from the mouth or shoulder. If done correctly by an expert executioner, the victim could live for days, suspended in agony, their own weight gradually driving the stake deeper with every breath. Vlad turned impalement into theater, into psychological warfare raised to the level of dark art. He created forests of the impaled, thousands of stakes arranged in geometric patterns around cities he conquered. Merchants entering Wallachian territory would encounter these groves of the dead and dying, the air thick with the stench of blood and waste, the sound of moaning creating a chorus of damnation. The message was clear. This was the price of resistance, of betrayal, of even the slightest offense against the prince's law. In 1461, when Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, sent envoys to demand tribute, Vlad asked them why they did not remove their turbans in his presence. The envoys replied that it was not their custom to uncover their heads. Vlad responded that he wished to strengthen their custom. He had the turbans nailed to their skulls with iron spikes. The message sent to Mehmed was unmistakable. The boy who had once been your hostage now fears neither your power nor your wrath. When Mehmed himself invaded Wallachia with an army numbering in the tens of thousands, he encountered Vlad's masterwork outside the city of Targovite. A forest of the impaled stretched for miles, containing over 20,000 corpses. Turkish prisoners of war, Bulgarian collaborators, Wallachian traitors, even women and children, all suspended on stakes in varying stages of decay. The Sultan, who had ordered the deaths of thousands in the siege of Constantinople, who had built pyramids of skulls to celebrate his victories, was so disturbed by the sight that he withdrew his army. He left the campaign to his generals and returned to Constantinople, reportedly unable to sleep without seeing the impaled dead in his dreams. The stories multiplied, growing darker with each telling. Vlad allegedly dipped his bread in the blood of his victims while watching them die. He forced mothers to eat their impaled children. He skinned men alive and displayed their hides as decorations. He impaled a man for not removing his hat, cut off the breasts of women who displeased him, and roasted children alive while forcing their mothers to watch. Some of these tales were propaganda, exaggerations spread by his enemies, particularly the Saxon merchants whose criminal activities he had violently suppressed. But many were documented by multiple sources, including his own countrymen. The truth was terrible enough, without embellishment. What made Vlad truly terrifying was not the brutality itself, but the cold logic behind it. He was not mad, not in the traditional sense. Every atrocity served a purpose, a calculated objective. He impaled thieves to establish law and order, claiming afterward that a golden cup could be left at a public fountain and no one would dare steal it. He massacred the poor and sick, burning them alive in a great hall, asking rhetorically if they would like to be free of their suffering. He eliminated rival claimants, foreign merchants who undermined Wallachian trade, and anyone who represented a threat to his absolute authority. In his mind, he was not a monster but a surgeon, cutting away the diseased flesh to save the body of the state. But in 1462, Vlad's reign of terror came to an abrupt and mysterious end. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, son of the legendary John Hunyadi, who had fought alongside Vlad's father, marched into Wallachia not as an ally but as a captor. The exact circumstances remain shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Matthias claimed to possess letters proving that Vlad had been negotiating with the Ottomans, planning to betray the Christian alliance. These letters surfaced at precisely the right moment to justify Vlad's arrest, yet most historians believe them to be forgeries, fabrications created to legitimize an act of political necessity. Why did Matthias betray his former ally? Some claim it was about money. The Pope had sent funds to support a crusade against the Ottomans, funds that Matthias had diverted to his own treasury. Arresting Vlad as a traitor provided justification for abandoning the crusade and keeping the gold. Others suggest it was fear. Vlad had become too powerful, too unpredictable, a rabid dog that might turn on its master at any moment. And some whisper that it was something darker still, that Matthias recognized in Vlad, a darkness that exceeded even the pragmatic cruelties of medieval politics, that he saw a man who had ceased to be human and become something else entirely. Vlad was taken to Visegrad, then transferred to Corvin Castle in Hunedoara, the ancestral seat of the Corvinus family. The dungeons there would become his world for the next 12 to 14 years. The exact length of his imprisonment remains disputed, another mystery in a life built on them. What is certain is that he entered those cells as Vlad the Impaler, the prince who had defied Sultan Mehmed himself, who had built forests of the dead and ruled through calculated terror. But who was this man, really, as the dungeon doors closed behind him? Was he a monster who had finally met his match? A patriot who had defended Christian Europe with the only weapons that could stand against the Ottoman tide? Or was he something more complex, more human, and therefore more terrifying? A man who had learned as a child that survival meant becoming what you most feared, that power required the willingness to commit any atrocity, that justice and vengeance were interchangeable concepts when filtered through sufficient trauma. In Corvin Castle's darkness, two ruthless men collided. Matthias Corvinus, the Renaissance king, who would be celebrated for his wisdom and cultural achievements, and Vlad Dracula, the Impaler prince, whose name would become synonymous with evil itself. One imprisoned the other, but which was the true monster? The man who killed thousands in the name of order, or the man who betrayed an ally in the name of political expedience? The question that echoes through the centuries is this: did Vlad enter those dungeons as a devil, his soul already consumed by the atrocities he had committed? Or did something break in those dark years of captivity, transforming whatever remained of the traumatized hostage, the betrayed son, the vengeful prince, into the monster that legend would remember? The stone walls of Corvin Castle hold no answers, only whispers of a man who became a myth, and a myth that became immortal. The journey from the blood-soaked battlefields of Wallachia to the darkness of a Hungarian dungeon began in the winter of 1463, when Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, crossed into what he believed was Allied territory. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had once been his supporter, now saw opportunity in betrayal. The correspondence that survives in the Hungarian state archives tells us that Vlad was arrested under dubious charges, accused of conspiring with the Ottoman Turks, the very enemies he had spent his life fighting. History loves its ironies, and few are more bitter than this. The man who had impaled thousands of Turkish soldiers, who had turned the forests of his homeland into galleries of the dead, now found himself imprisoned by Christian hands. The specific location of his confinement remains debated among historians, but the strongest evidence points to Solomon's Tower, part of the Visegrad Castle complex overlooking the Danube River. This wasn't just any prison. The tower still stands today, a monument to medieval justice and cruelty, its stones weathered by centuries, but still bearing witness to the suffering contained within its walls. Modern measurements of the dungeon cell believed to have held Vlad reveal a space measuring approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls of stone blocks nearly 3 feet thick. The ceiling arched just 7 feet above the floor, low enough that a tall man would feel the oppressive weight of stone bearing down upon him constantly. There were no windows. This detail appears in every historical account, repeated by different chroniclers as if they couldn't quite believe it themselves. No natural light penetrated that space for 12 years. Not a single ray of sunlight. Not a glimpse of moon or stars. The only illumination came from torches in the corridor outside, their flickering light seeping through the gaps around the heavy wooden door, casting moving shadows that played tricks on a mind already teetering on the edge of sanity. The chains are still there today. Visitors to the tower can see them, mounted in the walls at shoulder height and near the floor, their iron links corroded but intact. The metal rings embedded in the stone are positioned in such a way that suggests a prisoner could be secured standing with arms spread, or forced to remain in a crouched position for hours or days. The stone around these mounting points is worn smooth, polished by centuries of something. Whether human contact or simple time, no one can say with certainty. Historical accounts of Vlad's treatment during these years contradict each other so dramatically that reconstructing the truth becomes an exercise in weighing conflicting testimonies. The Venetian diplomat and scholar Antonio Bonfini, writing in the 1480s, claimed that King Matthias treated Vlad with a degree of respect befitting a former prince. According to this version, Vlad was confined but not tortured, held in custody rather than subjected to the full horrors that Hungarian dungeons could inflict. Bonfini's account suggests that Vlad was eventually moved to more comfortable quarters in Buda, given a house under guard, and even allowed to marry into minor nobility. But other sources paint a vastly different picture. Serbian and Russian chronicles, compiled from eyewitness accounts and testimonies of merchants who traveled through Hungary during those years, describe systematic torture and deliberate psychological torment. These accounts speak of prolonged isolation, of days passing in absolute silence broken only by the screams of other prisoners echoing through stone corridors. They describe a regime designed not merely to contain a dangerous man, but to break him completely, to erase whatever remained of the proud prince who had defied empires. The truth, as always, likely exists somewhere between these extremes, shifting over the years of imprisonment. Perhaps Vlad was indeed tortured in the early years, then granted better conditions as political circumstances changed. Perhaps his treatment varied with the whims of his captors and the fluctuating relationship between Hungary and Wallachia. What remains undisputed is the isolation, the years spent cut off from the world he had known, from power, from purpose, from the identity he had forged in blood and fire. It's the detail about the rats and birds that has haunted historians and captured public imagination for centuries. This account comes from multiple sources, including the German pamphlets printed in the 1470s and 1480s, which were essentially the tabloid press of their era, sensational and unreliable, but sometimes containing kernels of disturbing truth. According to these accounts, guards or castle staff reported finding small birds and rats in Vlad's cell, impaled on tiny stakes whittled from the wooden splinters of his chair or bed frame, or fashioned from small bone. The image is almost too perfect, too symbolic, to trust entirely. The monster, unable to resist his nature even in captivity, practicing his signature cruelty on the only victims available to him, transforming his cell into a miniature theater of impalement. Some historians dismiss this as propaganda, another layer of demonization added to a man already portrayed as barely human. Others point out that such behavior would actually be consistent with severe psychological trauma and isolation-induced psychosis. A man driven mad by confinement, recreating the only sense of power and control he had ever known, even if his victims were now merely vermin and sparrows. One account, preserved in the records of Visegrad Castle and attributed to a guard named Istvan, describes sounds emanating from Vlad's cell during the deep hours of night. Not screams or pleas for mercy, which would have been understandable, even expected. Instead, witnesses reported hearing soft sounds, rhythmic and deliberate, the creak of wood being slowly split, faint scratching, and sometimes, most disturbing of all, what sounded like satisfied murmuring, as if the prisoner was speaking softly to himself in a language the guards couldn't understand, his tone suggesting pleasure rather than despair. Another fragment, this one from a letter written by a castle administrator to the Hungarian royal court in 1468, 5 years into Vlad's imprisonment, requests permission to move the prisoner to a different cell. The reason given is vague but unsettling. The letter speaks of disturbances, of other prisoners in nearby cells becoming agitated by sounds, and curiously, by silences from Vlad's dungeon. The administrator notes that the prisoner requires less food than other inmates, raising questions about what he might be eating instead. The request was apparently denied. Consider what 12 years of such confinement does to a human mind. Modern psychology gives us frameworks for understanding the effects of prolonged isolation. The dissolution of self that occurs when deprived of human contact and environmental stimulation. Hallucinations become common after just weeks of solitary confinement. The sense of time disintegrates. The boundaries between self and surroundings begin to blur. Survivors of such experiences describe feeling as though they were becoming ghosts, losing the ability to remember what it felt like to be human. Now imagine this happening to a man who had already been shaped by trauma, who had spent years as a hostage of the Ottoman Empire in his youth, who had learned to survive through ruthlessness and controlled brutality. Whatever humanity Vlad possessed before his imprisonment, whatever capacity for mercy or compassion might have existed beneath the calculated cruelty of his rule, those years in darkness must have erased it entirely. The man who emerged from Solomon's Tower in 1475 was not simply broken or damaged. He was transformed, reconstructed by isolation and madness, into something that barely resembled what had entered. The historical record tells us that Vlad was eventually released, his fortunes restored through the complex political machinations of the era. He married a woman related to the Hungarian royal family. He regained some measure of status, and eventually, he returned to Wallachia for a brief final reign. But the accounts of those who saw him after his release describe a changed man. His eyes, they said, had a quality that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable, a flatness that suggested something essential had been hollowed out and replaced with something else entirely. In 1475, when Vlad walked out of that dungeon into sunlight he hadn't seen in over a decade, servants at Visegrad Castle were given the task of cleaning his former cell. What they found has been described in scattered accounts over the centuries. Small bones arranged in patterns, scratches on the walls that might have been tallies of days, or might have been something else entirely. And in the darkest corner, away from the faint light that entered through the door, a collection of tiny stakes, each one carefully sharpened, some still bearing remnants of fur or feather. The cell remains today, preserved as part of the castle's historical exhibits. Visitors report an atmosphere that feels different from other medieval dungeons, though they struggle to articulate exactly how. Perhaps it's the absolute darkness when the lights are turned off, a blackness so complete it feels physical. Perhaps it's the chains in the walls, positioned at angles that suggest torture methodically applied. Or perhaps it's simply the knowledge of what happened there. The weight of 12 years of isolation pressing down through the centuries, a darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light and everything to do with the human capacity for psychological destruction. Whatever transformed in that cell, whatever humanity was lost, and whatever cruelty was refined and perfected in the dark, it walked out into the world again when those dungeon doors finally opened. And Wallachia would bleed for it one final time. The stone steps descend 23 meters beneath Corvin Castle, spiraling deeper into darkness with each footfall. The air changes as you go down, growing colder with an intensity that defies logical explanation. Visitors often arrive wearing light jackets suitable for the Romanian autumn above, only to find themselves shivering uncontrollably by the time they reach the bottom level. The temperature here holds steady at 7 degrees Celsius year-round, even during the height of summer when the castle grounds above bake in 30-degree heat. Scientists have measured this anomaly repeatedly. They point to the thickness of the walls, the depth below ground, the lack of sunlight. But their explanations somehow feel insufficient when you stand in these chambers yourself, when the cold seems to emanate not from the stone, but from something else entirely, something that scientific instruments cannot quite capture. The torture chamber of Corvin Castle represents one of the most complete medieval interrogation facilities still standing in Eastern Europe. Unlike many castle dungeons that have been sanitized for modern tourism, converted into storage spaces, or simply collapsed with age, these rooms remain largely as they were in the 15th century. The devices are still here. The walls still bear their marks. The stones still whisper their secrets to those willing to listen. Your guide, usually a local historian who has spent years studying these depths, will tell you that the chamber complex consists of 6 interconnected rooms, each designed for a specific phase of what they called justice in medieval times. The progression was methodical, almost procedural. Prisoners moved from room to room as their interrogations intensified, as their bodies were pushed further toward breaking points that seem unimaginable to modern sensibilities. The first room contains the rack, a device so infamous that its very name has become synonymous with torture itself. This particular rack dates to the 1400s, confirmed through analysis of the wood and iron construction methods. It sits low to the ground, approximately waist height, constructed from blackened oak beams worn smooth by countless hands. The mechanism is surprisingly simple in design, yet devastatingly effective in application. The victim would be laid across the horizontal surface, wrists and ankles bound to separate rollers at either end. As the torturer turned the handles, the rollers would move in opposite directions, stretching the body with relentless mechanical precision. The rack at Corvin shows particular wear patterns on its leather straps, grooves cut deep into the material from struggling limbs. Historians examining these marks have estimated this single device may have been used on hundreds of prisoners over its operational lifetime. The wooden frame itself bears stains that chemical analysis has confirmed as human blood, though degraded by centuries of time. What strikes visitors most intensely, however, is not the device itself, but the scratch marks surrounding it on the floor. Deep gouges in the stone, clearly made by fingernails, creating desperate trails that lead nowhere. Someone dragged across this floor had clawed at the stone hard enough to leave permanent marks. Imagine the terror required to produce such force. The second chamber houses what the guides call the strappado, a deceptively simple apparatus consisting of a rope, a pulley, and a ceiling beam. The prisoner's hands would be bound behind their back. Then the rope would haul them upward, suspending their entire body weight from their shoulders wrenched backward in their sockets. Many victims dislocated both shoulders within minutes. Some interrogators would add weights to the prisoner's feet, or raise them high then drop them suddenly, stopping just before they hit the ground. The violent jerk would tear ligaments, shred muscle tissue, and often render the arms permanently useless. The beam at Corvin Castle still shows the pulley groove, a smooth depression worn into the wood by rope friction over decades of use. Archaeological examination of the chamber floor revealed something particularly disturbing during renovations in 1998. Beneath a layer of later stonework, workers discovered the original medieval floor, and embedded in it were dozens of human teeth. Not skulls, not bones, but specifically teeth, scattered across the area directly below where prisoners would have hung. The leading theory suggests that victims bit down so hard against the pain that their teeth shattered, falling to the floor where they remained for 500 years until renovation crews brought them back to light. But it is the third chamber that draws the most attention, the most whispered speculation, the most uncomfortable silence from tour groups. Here stands an Iron Maiden, one of only a handful of authenticated medieval examples still in existence. For years, historians debated whether Iron Maidens were real torture devices or later inventions, myths created to make the medieval period seem more barbaric than it actually was. The Corvin Castle Maiden settled many of those debates. Metallurgical analysis dates its construction to approximately 1460, placing it squarely within Vlad Dracula's lifetime, and precisely during the period when he was imprisoned in Hungary under Matthias Corvinus. The device stands slightly taller than an average man, shaped like a woman's figure, hence the name. It is constructed from iron plates riveted together, with a hinged front that opens to reveal an interior just barely large enough to contain a human body. The inside surface is lined with iron spikes, carefully positioned to pierce flesh without immediately striking vital organs. The design reflects a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, an intentional effort to maximize pain while delaying death. What makes the Corvin Maiden particularly significant is the documentation that accompanies it. Castle records from 1476 mention the Iron Lady in the lower chambers in an inventory of equipment maintained by the castle garrison. A Hungarian chronicle from 1482 describes a Wallachian prisoner being placed inside the Maiden of Sorrow as punishment for crimes against the crown. Historians have long speculated about whether that Wallachian prisoner might have been Vlad himself, held here during his imprisonment, potentially subjected to interrogation methods that mirrored his own notorious practices. The irony would be profound and somehow fitting. Vlad Dracula, whose name became inseparable from impalement, who terrorized the Ottoman Empire with forests of dying men mounted on stakes, imprisoned in a castle where Hungarian authorities possessed their own instruments of torment. Some researchers suggest that Matthias Corvinus specifically chose Corvin Castle for Vlad's imprisonment precisely because of these facilities, that the choice was psychological warfare as much as physical detention. You want to understand a man like Vlad. You subject him to his own methods. You break him down using the very techniques he perfected. You make him feel what he made others feel. The fourth and fifth chambers contain various implements of lesser fame but equal brutality. Thumb screws, devices that would crush fingers bone by bone. Tongue tearers, instruments designed to grip and remove the tongue entirely. Branding irons marked with various symbols, heated in a small forge whose chimney still blackens the ceiling. Each device tells its own story of pain, methodically applied, of information extracted, of confessions forced. But it is the discoveries within the walls themselves that transform these chambers from historical exhibits into something far more unsettling. During structural reinforcement work in 2003, engineers examining the dungeon walls made a discovery that temporarily halted all renovation efforts. Behind a section of wall in the sixth chamber, they found a hollow space, a gap approximately 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall. Inside this hidden cavity were human remains. Not a single skeleton, but parts of at least 7 different individuals, carefully arranged, deliberately concealed. The bones showed marks consistent with torture and execution. Several skulls bore signs of blunt force trauma. Multiple long bones had been broken, then healed badly, suggesting torture followed by imprisonment rather than immediate death. But most disturbing were the cut marks on several bones, precise incisions that forensic analysis indicated were made peri-mortem, around the time of death. Someone had been conducting what we might now call experiments, testing how bodies responded to various injuries, documenting the results through direct examination. Castle records from the 1470s mention a Hungarian scholar, a man named Benedict, who served Matthias Corvinus as an advisor on Wallachian affairs. Several letters reference Benedict's studies of the Wallachian methods and his efforts to understand the prince's techniques. Historians now believe Benedek may have used the Corvin Castle dungeons as a research facility, attempting to reverse engineer Vlad's torture methodologies by recreating them under controlled conditions. The bones in the wall may represent his subjects, his test cases, hidden away when his experiments concluded or when political winds shifted and such activities became inconvenient to acknowledge. The scratch marks mentioned earlier appear throughout all 6 chambers, but they concentrate most heavily in the 6th room, the deepest chamber, the one farthest from daylight and hope. These are not random gouges, but patterns, repetitions, deliberate marks. Some form words in medieval Hungarian, prayers mostly, appeals to saints, and to God. Others mark days, counting methods scratched into stone by prisoners tracking their captivity. The longest sequence counts to 347 marks before stopping abruptly. Almost a full year of imprisonment in this darkness, before something happened, before the counting stopped. Modern visitors to these chambers report experiences that the castle administration documents but cannot explain. More than 60% of tour groups mention sudden temperature drops even beyond the ambient cold, localized zones where the air becomes noticeably colder for no apparent reason. People report sensations of being touched, of feeling breath on their necks, of hearing whispers in languages they cannot identify. Cameras malfunction with unusual frequency in the 6th chamber specifically, batteries draining instantly, electronic equipment simply shutting down despite being fully charged moments before. The castle guides have their own stories, accounts they share reluctantly and usually only after you have visited multiple times, after they have decided you are genuinely interested rather than simply sensation-seeking. One guide, a woman named Ileana, who has worked at Corvin for 17 years, describes the sensation of being watched in the torture chambers as universal, something that every guide experiences but learns to manage. She explains that you develop a relationship with the presence in these rooms. You acknowledge it, respect it, but you do not let it control you. She has felt hands on her shoulders when no one stood behind her. She has heard her name called in the empty chambers during early morning preparations, before tourists arrive. She has seen shadows move across walls where no light source could cast them. Archaeological work continues in the lower levels. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2019 revealed what appear to be additional chambers beneath the current dungeon floor, rooms that have been filled in or deliberately sealed. Excavation proposals face opposition from preservation groups who argue that some historical sites should remain undisturbed, that we have learned enough from what we have already found. But others counter that we have a responsibility to uncover the full truth, to document what actually happened here, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. The most recent discovery came just 2 years ago, during routine maintenance on the drainage systems. Workers found a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through, connecting the 6th chamber to a previously unknown room, approximately 10 meters away. The passage had been deliberately concealed behind false stonework. The room it led to contained a single chair bolted to the floor, facing a blank wall, covered entirely in scratch marks so dense they had worn the stone smooth in places. Someone had been kept in this room, isolated even from other prisoners, forced to sit facing that wall for extended periods. The scratch marks suggest they were allowed to stand occasionally, or perhaps they forced themselves up despite restraints, driven by psychological need to leave some mark, some evidence of their existence. Samples taken from the chair revealed human DNA degraded by age, but still partially analyzable. The genetic markers suggest a male individual of probable Eastern European descent. Dating techniques place his confinement sometime in the late 1500s. We will never know his name, his crime, or how long he spent in that hidden room. But we know he was there. We know he scratched at that wall until the stone wore smooth. We know he left part of himself behind in ways that modern science can still detect 5 centuries later. The cold remains. Visitors continue to shiver. The scratch marks continue to whisper their silent testimony. And deep beneath Corvin Castle, in chambers where medieval justice left permanent marks on stone and bone, and perhaps on something less tangible, the darkness waits with patient, persistent memory. The night shift at Corvin Castle has a reputation. Among the security guards and caretakers who work the region's historic sites, drawing assignment to the castle after dark is considered either a test of courage or a punishment, depending on who you ask. The turnover rate for night watchmen tells its own story. Few last more than 6 months before requesting transfer to daylight duties or finding work elsewhere entirely. Stefan Moldovan worked nights at Corvin for 3 years before he finally left in 2018. A former military policeman, he was not a man prone to flights of imagination or easy to unsettle. Yet, in his final weeks, colleagues noticed he had begun carrying a second flashlight, keeping both trained ahead of him as he made his rounds. He stopped entering certain areas alone. When he handed in his resignation, he was forthright about his reasons. The castle, he said, was occupied by more than tourists and memories. His testimony, recorded by a local historian before he moved to Bucharest, describes a consistent pattern of experiences concentrated in the dungeon levels, particularly in the areas traditionally associated with Vlad TII's imprisonment in the 1460s. The phenomena began small. Doors he had secured would be standing open when he returned on his rounds. The heavy wooden door to the cell identified as Vlad's chamber, fitted with a modern lock for preservation purposes, required resecuring multiple times each night. He checked the mechanism repeatedly, had it replaced twice, but the problem persisted. Then came the sounds. Metallic scraping against stone, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing up from the lower dungeon passages. The distinctive drag and clink of chains being pulled across rock floors. Stefan would descend with his flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed to resist illumination, finding nothing that could account for what he had heard. No loose fixtures, no maintenance equipment, no animals. Just stone and shadow, and a cold that settled into his bones, despite the season. Tour guide Maria Popescu has worked at Corvin since 2006, leading groups through the castle's labyrinthine interior 5 days each week. She speaks carefully when discussing the castle's atmosphere, aware that her livelihood depends on the tourist trade, reluctant to be dismissed as someone feeding sensational stories to visitors. But in private conversations, away from the official narratives, she describes experiences that have left her shaken. The temperature anomalies are impossible to ignore. In Vlad's cell, even during summer months when the rest of the dungeon maintains a cool but stable temperature, visitors and staff encounter sudden drops that transform breath to mist. Digital thermometers, carried by paranormal investigation teams, have recorded plunges of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius within seconds, localized to specific areas. The cold moves. Maria describes it as a presence that shifts through the space, a pocket of winter that passes through the stone chamber like something breathing. She has also witnessed the shadow. Multiple guides report it independently, describing the same phenomenon. A humanoid silhouette, taller than average, standing motionless in the corner where the cell's walls meet at their deepest point. It appears in peripheral vision but vanishes when looked at directly. Some witnesses describe it as impossibly dark, a black that seems to absorb the beam of flashlights rather than reflect it. Maria saw it clearly one afternoon in 2012, while ushering a group through. She glanced into the cell ahead of her tour and saw the figure, utterly still, facing the wall. When she looked again a moment later, nothing remained but empty stone. The paranormal investigation community has developed considerable interest in Corvin Castle over the past 2 decades. Teams from Romania, Hungary, Germany, and Britain have conducted overnight investigations, deploying an array of detection equipment designed to document phenomena beyond normal sensory perception. The evidence they have collected resists easy dismissal. Electromagnetic field detectors register significant fluctuations in the dungeon areas, particularly around the cell attributed to Vlad. The readings spike without apparent cause, equipment registering fields of 4 to 7 milligauss in locations with no electrical wiring, no power sources, no conventional explanation. The patterns are not random. Investigators report that the spikes occur in response to specific questions posed aloud, as if something present is reacting to interrogation. The photographic evidence proves more difficult to categorize. Digital cameras malfunction with unusual frequency in the dungeons, displaying error messages, draining fully charged batteries in minutes, or capturing images distorted by interference that resembles neither lens flare nor camera shake. Among the hundreds of photographs taken, certain images stand out. shadow masses that appear in multiple frames, maintaining consistent shape and position across sequential shots. Orbs of light, dismissed by many researchers as dust or moisture, appearing in such quantity and with such regular geometric patterns that some investigators struggle to attribute them to natural causes. But the most compelling evidence comes from electronic voice phenomenon recordings, audio captured on digital devices that document sounds imperceptible to human hearing during the recording session, but audible upon playback. A British team in 2015 spent 72 hours in the castle, recording continuously in the dungeon areas. Their equipment captured over 40 distinct anomalous sounds. Most were ambiguous, subject to interpretation, potentially explainable as acoustic tricks or environmental noise. 3 recordings stood apart. The first, captured at 2:47 in the morning in Vlad's cell, contains what sounds distinctly like labored breathing, ragged and wet, continuing for 18 seconds. No one was in the cell at the time. The second, recorded in an adjacent passage, captures a voice, low and male, speaking a single word in what linguists have tentatively identified as medieval Romanian, or possibly Hungarian. The word translates approximately as remember or witness. The third recording remains the most disturbing. 7 minutes of chain sounds, dragging and scraping, accompanied by what the investigators describe as impacts, as if something heavy was being struck repeatedly against stone. These patterns appear across decades of independent testimonies. Guards who never met Stefan Moldovan report identical experiences in the same location. Investigation teams separated by years document similar electromagnetic readings, temperature anomalies, and photographic irregularities. The consistency suggests either an elaborate collective delusion or something genuinely present in those ancient stones. Then there is Tower 13, known locally as Turnul Early Teeler, the Screaming Tower. It rises from the castle's eastern wall, a cylindrical stone structure dating to the 15th century. The tower served various purposes across the centuries, from lookout post to storage space, and at times, it is whispered, as an isolation cell for prisoners who required special containment. The designation of 13 is unofficial, a number assigned by locals rather than historians, but the name has persisted because of what people hear there. The screams begin after dark, typically between midnight and 3 in the morning. Multiple witnesses, including castle staff, security personnel, and investigators who have camped overnight in the courtyard, report hearing cries of anguish emanating from the tower. The sounds are described with unsettling consistency across testimonies, high-pitched, prolonged, filled with agony and terror. Not animal sounds, though witnesses struggle to categorize them as definitively human. Something about the quality of the screaming strikes listeners as fundamentally wrong, as if the source is forcing sound through a throat damaged beyond normal function. Nicolae Vasilescu, a paranormal researcher from Cluj-Napoca, spent 5 nights in 2019 attempting to document the phenomenon. He positioned recording equipment at various points around the tower and maintained watch with infrared cameras. On the 3rd night, at 1:17 in the morning, the screaming began. His recordings captured 7 minutes of the sounds, clear and undeniable. He describes his reaction as primal fear, an overwhelming urge to flee that required conscious effort to override. The sound, he said, bypassed rational thought and triggered something ancient in the human nervous system, a recognition of suffering that demanded either rescue or escape. Analysis of his recordings revealed no matches to known animal vocalizations. The frequency patterns, the duration of individual cries, the intervals between screams, none corresponded to cataloged wildlife in the region. Skeptics suggested owls, foxes, cats in distress, but wildlife experts who reviewed the audio could not confirm these identifications. The sounds remain unattributed. What disturbs witnesses most is the response of animals to the screaming. Dogs in the village below the castle, normally vocal at night, fall silent when the tower begins. Birds roosting in the castle walls vacate en masse, visible as clouds of movement on infrared cameras. The local wildlife appears to recognize something in those sounds that triggers flight response. Skeptical perspectives exist, of course. Dr. Adrian Popa, a psychologist from the University of Bucharest, who has studied paranormal belief systems, suggests that the castle's reputation creates expectation bias. Visitors and staff anticipate unusual experiences, priming their perception to interpret ordinary phenomena as supernatural. Old buildings creak and settle. Temperature varies based on airflow and stone density. Shadows move with changing light. Sounds echo strangely through medieval architecture. The human brain, eager for pattern and meaning, constructs narratives from randomness. Yet this explanation struggles against the specificity and consistency of the reports. Different witnesses, separated by years, describing identical shadow figures in the same corner of the same cell. Temperature drops measured by calibrated equipment, not human perception. Sounds recorded on digital devices, available for analysis, not merely remembered and embellished. The patterns persist regardless of whether witnesses believe in paranormal phenomena before entering the castle. The castle staff have developed informal protocols for managing what they experience. Certain areas are avoided after dark when possible. Guards work in pairs in the dungeon levels. No one enters the Screaming Tower alone at night, and even during daylight, visits are brief and purposeful. These are practical accommodations to shared experience, unofficial acknowledgments that something in Corvin Castle resists conventional explanation. What remains in those stones, accumulated across 6 centuries of imprisonment, torture, and death? The castle has witnessed suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. Thousands passed through its dungeons across the medieval period and beyond. Vlad Tepes himself spent years in confinement within those walls, his reputation for cruelty preceding and following him. If stones could absorb the anguish enacted upon them, if suffering could imprint itself on matter, what monument would retain more than Corvin? The phenomena continue. Night watchmen still report unexplained sounds in the dungeons. Tour guides still encounter the inexplicable cold in Vlad's cell. The Screaming Tower still wakes the night with cries that resist identification. And investigators still arrive with equipment and skepticism, departing with recordings they cannot explain and memories that interrupt their sleep. The castle endures, keeping whatever dwells within its ancient walls, offering neither answers nor peace to those who venture into its depths after dark. The iron door of his cell in Corvin Castle swung open for the final time in 1475, and the man who emerged was not the same prince who had been dragged into captivity 12 years earlier. Vlad Dracula walked free, but something fundamental had broken during those years in the darkness. His captors in Hungary had released him not out of mercy, but because they needed him. The Ottomans were pressing harder at the borders of Christendom, and desperate times required desperate measures. They needed a monster to fight monsters. What they failed to understand was just how thoroughly they had perfected the weapon they now unleashed. The records of his final reign are sparse, but what survives paints a picture of escalating horror that shocked even those who remembered his first rule. Contemporary accounts suggest that the restraint he had sometimes shown before his imprisonment, the political calculations that had occasionally tempered his violence, were completely gone. The monks who documented his return to the throne of Wallachia wrote in trembling script about a prince who seemed to take pleasure in cruelty for its own sake, who no longer needed justification or reason to inflict suffering. Where once he had impaled to instill terror or maintain order, now he impaled because it had become the only language he understood. One German pamphlet from 1476 describes an incident shortly after his restoration to power. A group of Saxon merchants, unaware that Vlad had returned to rule, entered Wallachia seeking trade agreements. These were men from communities that had opposed him during his first reign, but they came under flags of truce, believing enough time had passed for old grievances to fade. Vlad received them courteously at first, offering them food and wine, asking detailed questions about their families and their cities. Then, without warning or accusation, he ordered them impaled in a circle around his castle courtyard. The pamphlet claims he had his evening meal brought outside so he could dine while watching them die, and that he complained the blood ruined his appetite, so he had servants wash the stakes between victims to keep his view cleaner. What makes this account particularly chilling is its casual tone. The writer does not present this as an exceptional act of brutality, but as typical behavior for Vlad's final reign. The prince who had once used impalement as a tool of statecraft now wielded it as casually as another man might order wine. Turkish sources from the same period corroborate this escalation. describing whole villages found impaled along the roads, not as punishment for any specific crime, but simply because Vlad's army had passed through. One Ottoman commander wrote that his men refused to advance into certain territories because the forests of impaled bodies had become so dense that the roads were impassable, and the smell of death hung so thick in the air that soldiers were collapsing before they even encountered enemy forces. But perhaps the most disturbing accounts come from those closest to him. A Wallachian boyar who served in Vlad's court during these final months wrote a letter to relatives in Transylvania, urging them to flee the region entirely. In it, he describes a prince who no longer slept, who wandered the castle at night speaking to people who were not there, who would sometimes stop mid-sentence during council meetings and stare at nothing for long minutes before suddenly ordering executions. The boyar writes that Vlad seemed to be conducting conversations with invisible companions, and that more than once he heard the prince laughing alone in empty rooms, the sound echoing through stone corridors in a way that made grown men cross themselves and whisper prayers. The mystery of how this transformed prince met his end has haunted historians for centuries. The official record states that Vlad died in battle against the Ottomans sometime between late 1476 and early 1477. The date itself remains uncertain, lost in the chaos of those final campaigns. According to this version, he fell fighting the Turkish forces that had plagued him his entire life, going down as a warrior should, sword in hand, defending Christian territory against the Muslim advance. It is a clean ending, a heroic conclusion to a troubled story. But the evidence suggests something far more complicated and sinister. Turkish sources make no mention of killing Vlad in battle. This is significant because Ottoman chroniclers meticulously recorded the deaths of important enemies, especially one as notorious as Dracula. The absence of any triumphant account of his demise in their records raises immediate questions. If the great impaler had fallen to Turkish blades, surely they would have celebrated such a victory, would have paraded his body or at least documented the achievement. Instead, there is only silence from Constantinople regarding his death. Alternative theories emerged almost immediately. Some contemporary accounts whisper of assassination by his own men, soldiers who could no longer bear serving under a prince whose cruelty had become indiscriminate and unpredictable. One chronicle suggests that Wallachian boyars, terrified that Vlad's brutality would bring Ottoman retribution down on the entire nation, conspired to murder him during a military campaign. According to this version, they dressed Turkish soldiers in Wallachian uniforms and had them attack Vlad during a skirmish, so that his death would appear to be the result of battlefield confusion rather than deliberate betrayal. Another theory points to political rivals within the broader regional power structure. Vlad had made countless enemies during his lifetime, both among Ottoman sympathizers and Christian nobility who found his methods distasteful. His unpredictability during his final reign made him a liability even to those who had supported his return to power. It would not have been difficult for any number of factions to arrange his death and ensure it looked like a casualty of war. The chaotic nature of the borderlands in that era meant that men disappeared in battle regularly, and questions about the specific circumstances of their deaths rarely received satisfactory answers. But the deepest mystery was still to come, buried quite literally in the earth, waiting to shock investigators centuries later. According to tradition, Vlad's body was taken to Snagov Monastery, an isolated religious community on an island in Lake Snagov, roughly 25 miles north of Bucharest. The monastery claimed to house his remains, and for hundreds of years, pilgrims and curious travelers would visit the site, paying respects or simply marveling at the final resting place of the infamous Impaler Prince. A stone marker indicated where his bones supposedly lay beneath the church floor. In 1932, a team of archaeologists led by historian Dinu Rossetti received permission to excavate the site. The goal was to finally confirm the location of Vlad's remains and perhaps to study them, to learn what they could about the physical reality of the man behind the legends. The excavation was conducted with all proper archaeological protocols of the era. They carefully documented each layer of soil, cataloged every artifact they encountered, and approached the supposed grave site with academic rigor. When they finally reached the spot where Vlad Dracula should have been buried, where centuries of tradition insisted his bones must lie, they found nothing. The grave was empty. Not empty in the sense of being disturbed or robbed, which would at least provide an explanation, but empty as if no one had ever been buried there at all. There were no signs of grave robbery, no evidence that the earth had been dug up and bones removed. The soil layers suggested the site had remained undisturbed since its original interment, whenever and whatever that had been. But of Vlad's body, there was no trace. Not a bone fragment, not a scrap of burial cloth, nothing to indicate that the supposed tomb had ever contained human remains. The discovery sent shockwaves through historical and archaeological communities. How could a grave that had been venerated for centuries, that had been specifically marked and maintained by the monastery, turn out to be completely empty? The excavation team expanded their search, carefully examining other graves in the church, wondering if perhaps the location had been misidentified over the centuries. Near the altar, they found another grave, one that had not been marked or identified. This one contained skeletal remains along with fragments of a rich burial shroud and items that could have belonged to nobility. Could these be Vlad's true remains, misplaced or deliberately hidden in an unmarked location? The question remains unanswered. The bones found near the altar disappeared during World War II, lost in the chaos of the conflict, so modern forensic analysis has been impossible. We cannot know if they belong to Vlad or to some other nobleman buried in the monastery. The empty marked grave and the mysterious unmarked one have spawned countless theories. Some historians suggest that Vlad was never actually buried at Snagov, that his body was taken elsewhere by followers or enemies, and the monastery simply claimed his grave to attract pilgrims and prestige. Others propose that he was indeed buried there, but that his remains were secretly moved, either by monks who feared having such a notorious figure interred in their church, or by others with unknown motives. More esoteric theories have flourished in the absence of concrete answers. Some claim that Vlad's body was stolen by Turkish agents who wanted to desecrate the grave of their most hated enemy. Others suggest that supporters removed his remains to protect them from desecration, hiding them in a location that remains secret to this day. There are even whispers of occult involvement, claims that certain groups interested in dark magic sought the bones of such a notorious figure for their rituals. Without evidence, these theories remain speculation, but they speak to the enduring fascination with Vlad's ultimate fate. The emptiness of that grave has fed into a darker set of legends, stories that connect back to the place where Vlad's transformation truly occurred. Locals in Hunedoara, the city where Corvin Castle still stands, tell a different story about what happened to Vlad Dracula. They say that when his physical body died, whatever it was that made him Vlad, the essential darkness that had consumed him during 12 years of captivity, never left the dungeons where it had been forged. According to these whispers, something of Dracula remains chained in those underground cells, neither alive nor dead, transformed so completely by suffering that death itself could not claim him entirely. Tour guides at Corvin Castle, when the official groups have left and only locals remain, will tell you about the cold spot in the northeastern dungeon, the place where temperature drops noticeably even in summer heat. They mention the scratch marks that appear on the walls, fresh gouges in ancient stone that were not there the previous day. Some speak of sounds in the deepest hours of night, the rattle of chains where no chains hang, the sound of labored breathing in chambers that should be empty. These are not marketed to tourists, not printed in brochures or mentioned in official histories. They are the quiet acknowledgments of those who work in the castle, who lock its doors at night, who sometimes feel the weight of something watching from the darkness below. Perhaps it is poetic justice that Vlad Dracula, who imprisoned so many, who transformed captivity into an art of breaking human spirits, should himself remain eternally imprisoned in the place where his own spirit was shattered. That his body should rest nowhere, unquiet and unfound, while some essence of what he became lingers in the dungeons that created the monster. The empty grave at Snagov becomes less a mystery of misplaced remains, and more a confirmation that Vlad Dracula cannot be contained by something as simple as a tomb, cannot be laid to rest as ordinary men are, because what emerged from Corvin Castle in 1475 had ceased to be entirely human. The stone beneath your feet is worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Each depression in the floor tells a story of pacing, of restless movement in a space too small to contain a man's despair. You stand now in the belly of Visegrad Castle, in a cell carved from living rock, where Vlad Dracula spent 7 years of his life. 7 years. 2,555 days in darkness. But what actually happened in this silence? What transformed in this void? These are questions without answers, mysteries that haunt us still. The historical record goes quiet when Vlad enters these walls. We know he arrived sometime around 1462, a prisoner of King Matthias Corvinus. We know he emerged in 1474, somehow restored to favor, somehow married to the king's cousin. But the years between, they dissolve into shadow and contradiction. Some chronicles speak of torture. They whisper of chains and deprivation, of a prince reduced to catching rats and birds through his cell window, impaling them on splinters of wood because the impulse was too deep in his nature to suppress. The darkness didn't teach him cruelty, these stories suggest. It only revealed what was already there, stripped away the veneer of civilization until nothing remained but the essential violence of his soul. But other accounts paint a different picture entirely. They describe a comfortable captivity, almost a house arrest. They claim Vlad had rooms, not a cell, that he had servants and books, that he dined with nobles and maintained his dignity throughout. Some historians point to his eventual marriage to Ilona Szilágyi as proof that he must have moved in court circles during his imprisonment. You don't marry into the royal family from a dungeon, they argue. So which is true? Was he broken or protected? Tortured or privileged? The evidence points in every direction and settles nowhere. Perhaps the answer is both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the truth is that we need him to have suffered here, need this darkness to explain what he became. Or what we imagine he became. The vampire. The monster. The thing that haunts our nightmares. Run your hand along the wall. Feel the cold seep into your skin. Limestone holds temperature like memory holds pain. These stones have known winter for 500 years without pause. They've known darkness interrupted only by torchlight, and, much later, by the electric bulbs that now illuminate them for tourists seeking thrills and answers they'll never find. The mystery deepens when we follow Vlad beyond these walls, beyond even death itself. In 1576, over a century after Vlad's death, a Romanian Orthodox abbot named Ephraim went looking for the Impaler's burial place. He found a grave at Snagov Monastery, supposedly Vlad's final resting place, and recorded his discovery. The trail should end there. A grave, located, a mystery, solved. But when archaeologists opened that tomb in 1931, they found it empty. Not robbed. Not disturbed. Empty. Now. As if it had never held a body at all. Where are Vlad Dracula's remains? No one knows. Some believe he was never buried at Snagov, that the grave was always a decoy or a mistake. Others claim his body was moved, hidden, spirited away by followers or enemies for reasons lost to time. And some, in whispers reserved for late nights and locked doors, suggest that he was never truly dead to begin with. An empty grave. A missing body. The foundations of every vampire legend ever told. But here, in this cell, we face mysteries more immediate than missing bones. Security guards refuse to work night shifts alone in this section of the castle. They report footsteps in empty corridors, the sound of chains dragging across stone where no chains exist. Visitors describe sudden drops in temperature that have no source, cold spots that move and pulse like living things. One woman, an American tourist with no knowledge of the castle's history, had to be escorted out after suffering a panic attack in this very cell. She claimed she felt hands on her throat, felt breath on her face, felt an overwhelming presence of rage so intense it drove her to her knees. The medical staff found no physical cause. No explanation except the one she insisted upon with absolute certainty. Something was in that cell with her, and it wanted her to feel its fury. Dozens of photographs show unexplained light anomalies in this space. Orbs, streaks, shadows that appear in no other rooms of the castle. Electromagnetic field detectors go haywire with no identifiable source. Voice recorders pick up sounds that shouldn't exist. The rational mind has explanations, of course. Underground streams can create odd acoustics. Limestone formations can produce electromagnetic anomalies. Old buildings settle and groan. Tourists bring expectations and fear produces sensations that feel real, because, in a sense, they are real. The mind creates what it anticipates. But these explanations, however scientific, however reasonable, don't quite satisfy, do they? They don't account for the consistency of the reports, the specificity of the experiences, the way different people in different years describe the same inexplicable dread. So we arrive at the question that haunts every ghost story, every allegedly haunted place. What if consciousness can imprint on stone through suffering? What if 7 years of imprisonment, 7 years of whatever truly happened in this darkness, left something behind? Not a ghost in the traditional sense, not a spirit lingering between worlds, but an echo, a resonance, a recording pressed into the molecular structure of limestone through the sheer intensity of human emotion. Physics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. What happens to the energy of suffering? Where does it go when the sufferer dies? If consciousness is energy, if trauma generates a kind of force, might it not leave traces? Might 7 years of Vlad Dracula's rage, his humiliation, his plotting, his darkness, have soaked into these walls the way water soaks into stone? And if so, what plays back when conditions align? When a sensitive visitor arrives, when electromagnetic fields shift, when the veil between then and now grows thin, the questions multiply. They breed in darkness like the things Vlad supposedly caught and impaled in this cell. Did his imprisonment create the monster we remember? Or did it merely reveal what had always existed within him? Did the darkness teach him cruelty? Or strip away the pretense that he was ever anything else? When he emerged to reclaim his throne, was he a changed man, or simply an honest one? A man who'd had 7 years to contemplate the nature of power and decide that mercy was for those who'd never known true helplessness. We want causation. We want to understand. We need the darkness to explain the monster, because if it doesn't, if Vlad was always what he became, then what does that suggest about the human capacity for evil? That it simply exists, requires no trauma, no cause, no reason beyond itself. These questions have no answers, not real ones. Only theories that shift like shadows on dungeon walls. And then there are those who walk these corridors and feel watched. Not imagining it, they'll insist. Not projecting fear onto old stones. Actually watched, observed, assessed. They describe it as a weight, a presence, an attention so focused it raises the hair on their necks and quickens their pulse. Are they sensing history? The accumulated weight of centuries, the psychic residue of suffering and imprisonment? Or are they sensing something that refuses to become history, something that persists in an eternal present tense of rage and memory? Stand here long enough and you might feel it yourself. The temperature that drops 5 degrees in a space with no draft. The sense that the darkness is denser in some spots than others, that it has texture and intent. The irrational certainty that if you turned around fast enough, you'd see something in the corner where the torchlight dies. Perhaps consciousness doesn't end. Perhaps it transforms, attenuates, becomes something else. Perhaps Vlad Dracula, prince and prisoner and monster, left enough of himself in these stones that an echo remains. Not alive. Not dead. Something else. Something that waits in the dark and watches those who come looking for answers they'll never find. The door to this cell still closes. The lock still works. Stand outside it and imagine those 7 years. Imagine the door closing day after day, year after year, the light shrinking to a line and then to nothing. Imagine what that does to a mind, a soul, an identity. Some prisons hold their captives long after release. Some cells never truly empty. And some prisoners never truly leave, no matter how many centuries pass, no matter how completely their bones disappear from their graves. The door closes. The lock turns. And in the darkness, something that might be memory, or might be more than memory, continues its vigil, waiting for the next visitor brave enough or foolish enough to stand where Vlad stood and ask questions that have no answers. Only more questions. Only deeper darkness. Only the cold certainty that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some prisons were never meant to set their captives free. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.